All right, so this is the content for social studies today. And what we're starting off with first is talking about early hominids. And what that means is kind of we're going to look at the process of the theory of evolution and how people became Homo sapiens. So let me get started. So we're in chapter 2, section 1 of your book. Because we have such limited time, we're not going to be reading it together yet. But down below, you see this is a Homo habilis skull, also known as handyman. So, how do we know about these early hominids? This is prehistory, which means it's a time before writing. So, if there was no writing, how do we know what happened? It's a very good question. The only way we know what happened is because of things that are left behind, which are either fossils, which are bones that are basically turned to stone, or living tissue that's turned to stone, that tells us about how tall people were, or what they were eating, or sometimes how they died, or artifacts, which are things that were made and created by people for a purpose. So, the first people, let's jump into it. So, the remains of early humans. Hominid, the vocab word itself is an ancestor of humans, not meaning like, your great 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 grandmother, but something that is not a Homo sapien. We are modern humans, we are Homo sapiens. An early hominid, you're going to see, means something that's kind of like a person. You'd recognize them as at a distance, but they might kind of look like Bigfoot because they're going to be large and kind of scary and look quite different. So hominid bones range in age from about 5 million years to about 5,000 years old. And in the human report, they'll kind of give you a very brief overview of that. Some famous anthropologists that discovered these rare remains are Mary Leakey and Donald Johanson. Pretty famous people for discovering extremely important discovery. And where did they find it? Just sitting on the ground. They actually were just walking back to camp, and there's some anthropologists that were looking all over for bones, and they were walking back at the end of another day of finding nothing, and sitting there on the ground, sure enough, there were some remains. And then where do these remains come from? All over. The earliest hominid ancestors started out in Africa. They migrated, which we'll talk about migration eventually, into Asia, South America, Europe, and we'll talk about what they need. They needed clothing for cold climates. They had to develop boats. So if you've seen the movie Moana, that's early human migration, right? Where people of South America is a popular theory, and there's one that I happen to, my personal opinion, think there's some pretty good evidence for. Built boats and actually sailed out to these Polynesian islands. But we'll get into that. That's early human migration, which is coming up later. So there's a picture of those famous bone searchers, and on the right-hand side, you can see the bones that were found that were left behind. And you can see on the left side there some archaeology that's going on, which is just digging out in the dirt very slowly. And we're going to look at some archaeology as we go through quarter one. So early hominids we love. Australopithecus. This is covered in the other video. It means southern ape. You can see we don't have all of the bones that are left, but from those bones, we can tell roughly how tall this species was. We can tell by your bones how your body was designed to work, that they appeared in Africa 4 or 5 million years ago. The next one you want to know about, and we're kind of jumping in order. So this is the order it happened, but there are other species we're talking about. Homo habilis, which means handyman. What you need to know about Homo habilis. Homo habilis was the first to create stone tools, right, of the Stone Age. We're talking Paleolithic Stone Age era, a long time ago. Only about 4 feet tall, brain about half the size of ours. So would have walked on 2 feet, lived in Africa about 2.4 million years ago, human-like, but not the same as us. That's an early chopping tool. You can see it has a smooth edge for holding and a sharp, rough edge for scraping and slashing, and it's not very complicated, right? This is something that most people could go out if you knew the right kind of stone and be able to create. Now, I will tell you that it's not as simple as you might think. So it is a little more complicated than you believe, but you can see there's not a lot of complexity that goes into this. What were they using it for? Probably to process food, animals that they had killed to eat, to cut down things for building with. Pretty basic tool there. So that's why we call him Homo habilis, the handyman. He made tools. All right, now we're getting to Homo erectus, upright man. Now the other ones that we talked about, they walked upright most of the time, we think. Homo erectus, we believe, is the first one that walked upright all the time. Getting more complicated in their tool making. Their brain is getting a little bit larger, and that gives them the ability to control fire. They can't make fire, but if they found it in a wildfire, they could control it. They understood how to utilize it in different ways, to use it for cooking and for all that stuff. And then eventually they migrate out of Africa and into Europe. And so there's a recreation of what we think they may have looked like. And then there's us. So the fourth one you want to know about is us, Homo sapiens. As a species, we're extremely new. Uh, Looks like we're only about 200,000 years old. We've migrated all around the world. We fill every continent of Earth. And you know what we're capable of because you're a Homo sapien, right? Not only can we make a fire from sticks, but we can make SpaceX that can send two people into a space station around orbit. We can do all kinds of amazing stuff. We've developed language, civilization, tools, all kinds of awesome things that we're going to get into in more detail when we talk about Mesopotamia. Stone Age tools. So I'm going to show you a really cool video the next time we meet, where you're going to see how they make how are these things made. It's not as simple as just banging two rocks together. For some of the early choppers, that's not too far off, but there's all kinds of cool stuff with stone tools, and that making them, using them, and I'm going to show you more of that. But that's of course why we call it the Stone Age. Is they're making stone hand axes and scrapers and choppers and arrowheads and knives and all kinds of stuff. And then that goes from about 2.6 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago, when we enter the Bronze Age, right, or the Copper Age, even before that. We're going to talk about hunter-gatherers. So when humans, right, Homo sapiens, first kind of make our way onto the scene, we're hunter-gatherers, and it's exactly like it sounds. It means that as a species, we didn't stay in one place and build great civilizations and pyramids and huge buildings. We hunted and gathered. Think of it like camping, but it never ends. It's permanent, where you're constantly moving your tent to where the animals have migrated to and where the wild plants are growing that you can eat. So they would migrate and follow their food. For hunting, evidence shows that most hunting was done by men. They worked in groups, which means they probably had language. You would need that to be able to come up with a strategy to hunt and to deal with dividing it up fairly afterwards. They used animals for food and for clothing, right? We know that based off artifacts that were found when we actually get into Utsi the Iceman coming up. And of course, it's super dangerous. Living in the Stone Age would have been horrible for any of us because you just think about what they don't have access to, right? Medicine, as far as we know, any kind of technology that could call for help, like like we have 911 today and we have air conditioning. They don't have any of that stuff. And then gathering, women gathered the plants that were available. They're not farming. It's a really important distinction. They're not growing plants. At this point, no one has made the discovery that if you put a seed in the ground and you add some water, a plant will come, right? That's not been discovered yet. So they're kind of wandering around trying to find wild plants, which would have been much smaller. They would have produced apples and things that were much tinier than what we're used to today. They're also processing berries and things for cave art as well, and so they're starting to develop elements of a civilization. Now, to have a civilization, you have to have language. You have to be able to talk, and this is what creates a society. So language developed to make hunting easier and a way to develop relationships. And why do they do this? Ultimately, it's because it increases your chances of survival, right? And this is no different today. If you are stranded on an island by yourself, let's be honest, your chances of survival are not great. If you're stranded on an island with 10 other people, your chances of survival go way up. Even though 10 people need more food and more water, the chances are someone's going to be an expert on something. Right? This is why teams are successful. A well-functioning team is more successful than a single individual. And so why do they create societies and language? It's a simple reason. It's easier to survive. Right? Now, a society is a community of people that share a common culture. Societies develop because people were living and working closely with one another, just like you live in a society, right? We have agreements and rules where we don't steal, and there's things that are crimes, and there's behaviors that are acceptable and behaviors that are not acceptable, and we share a common language. And why do they do all that? Again, it gets back to it just makes it easier to survive. And then the last thing I'll show you here is along with their civilization from a functional standpoint of building shelter, collecting food, keeping people safe, raising their kids, they start to develop art as well. And so this is a cave painting, I believe it's from Lascaux. I don't remember exactly, but they're making art. And where does it come from? Well, someone figured out that if you take some charcoal stick from the fire, you can make some black marks. And if you crush up some berries or some wild pigments, you can push it onto the stone. And then we know that they were mixing animal fats in there to kind of make it spread like a paint. And the reason we know that is because you can do a chemical analysis on it. So what you're looking at right now, this would actually be considered an artifact. It's something made and used by people. And so this also tells us it's kind of a primary source because they're creating what they're seeing. And so we know in Europe that they would have had essentially what looked like wild cows. How do we know that? Well, because they were drawing it, and they're only going to be drawing what they see. So that's a little introduction to early hominids that goes with our Ed puzzle for today. We're going to do some fun stuff with this. I think you guys will really like early humans, and hopefully this is enjoyable. And if you don't like this one, I think you'll like the one on horrible histories, which has got some cool stuff as well.